quiet street, a tired nurse, walking home after a double shift, just minutes from her front door. Then, a siren, a voice, a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. She didn't fight, she didn't run, she was polite, but none of that mattered. What happened next would go viral, not because she screamed, but because she didn't. And the man who slammed her to the ground, 10 years later, he would die alone, abandoned by the very system he believed would protect him. This isn't just a story of injustice, it's the story of a quiet hero, and how her silence roared louder than any protest. The breeze barely moved that afternoon. It was one of those summer days that wrapped around your skin like warm gauze, heavy, slow, and silent. Everything in the neighborhood seemed half asleep. Lawns shimmered under the heat. Sprinklers rotated lazily. Somewhere, a wind chime clinked without rhythm. Lena Matthews adjusted her backpack as she stepped off the hospital bus. Her shoulders ached. Her feet, in worn sneakers, begged for relief. 12 hours in the pediatric wing will do that to you. She had smiled for her patients, even the frightened ones, even the ones with bad news. She had helped little ones through injections and sat with grieving parents in rooms too quiet. She had done what nurses do, held pain for others, carried it with grace. Now all she wanted was a glass of cold water, a shower, and the sound of her grandmother's old jazz records spinning in the living room. As she passed Mr. Delgado's porch, he waved from his rocking chair. She smiled back. "Long shift," he called. "The usual marathon," she replied. He chuckled. "You're a saint, Miss Lena." She didn't feel like a saint, just tired, and grateful for the quiet walk home. But peace doesn't always last. At the intersection of Oak and Mulberry, just 3 blocks from her home, Lena heard a low siren chirp, the sound too short to be alarming, but sharp enough to grab attention. A police cruiser rolled to a stop beside her. The windows were tinted. The door opened with a thud. "Hey," came the voice, sharp, commanding. Lena turned, her badge still around her neck, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hands where I can see him." She blinked, confused. "I'm just walking home." "Step back. Keep your hands up." She froze. It was the same kind of stillness she'd learned to maintain in a hospital emergency, when parents screamed and nurses shouted, and the only way to stay steady was to breathe and not react. "My name is Lena Matthews," she said, calmly, slowly. "I'm a registered nurse. I just got off a shift." The officer stepped forward. He was tall, his face tight, his hand near his belt, but not in a way that felt safe. "Where are you coming from?" "The Children's Hospital," she replied. "Just 2 blocks up." He glanced down at her name badge, then at her face, as if they didn't match. "You match a description," he said. She wanted to ask, what description? But something told her not to. And just like that, the moment turned. It was in the air, that hum of misunderstanding, thick and irreversible. She didn't resist, she didn't move, but something in her silence made him act faster than he should have. He reached out, not roughly, but not gently either. Her foot caught a crack in the sidewalk, and she stumbled. Her bag dropped, her ID skidded. She caught herself on one knee. "I'm not," she started, but the officer spoke over her. "Stay down." People say moments like these happen in slow motion. That wasn't true for Lena. It all moved too fast. A grip on her arm, the bark of a radio, the blur of someone yelling from across the street. Then, a click, not a gun, not a weapon, a camera shutter. She would never know the photographer's name, just that they were there, across the street, behind a porch column, watching, capturing. The photo would be shared over 3 million times in the next 48 hours. It showed Lena on the ground, one hand bracing herself, the other up in surrender, her name badge clearly visible, her face calm, not afraid, just exhausted, and the officer, his expression was unreadable, but the image spoke volumes. The photo wasn't supposed to be anything more than a reflex. The person who took it, a teenager named Devon, sitting on his aunt's porch across the street, hadn't even realized what he'd captured until his cousin pointed it out. She didn't even move. Devon had said later, "That's what got me." She just stayed still. The image traveled faster than Lena could keep up with. By the time she got home that day, it was already being reshared with hashtags and commentary. Some were outraged, some were skeptical. A few didn't even believe she was a nurse. Despite the hospital badge clearly visible in the photo, Lena sat on the edge of her bathtub that night, scrubbing gently at a scrape on her elbow, listening. to the faucet drip. Her grandmother knocked once, came in without waiting. "They're talking about you on Channel 9, she said softly. Lena looked up, her eyes tired but not afraid. "Am I supposed to say something?" she asked. Her grandmother didn't answer right away, just stood there, folding a towel that didn't need folding. "Sometimes silence is powerful," she said, "but sometimes silence becomes someone else's story." Lena didn't sleep that night, not because of the photo, not even because of the officer. It was the realization that everything she thought was private, her walk home, her moment of stillness, was now a symbol being used in ways she couldn't control. The next day at the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted. Her manager greeted her with a stiff smile. Her co-workers offered more coffee than usual. And the families she worked with, they treated her like something sacred and fragile at the same time. But Lena didn't want sympathy. She wanted her job. She wanted her routine. She wanted her patients to smile again when they saw her coming with their charts. Still, whispers followed her down the halls. Not cruel, just cautious. The hospital administration called her into a meeting. There were apologies, vague explanations, a mention that the Department of Public Safety had opened a review into the incident. They said her behavior was commendable, but the media storm had created complications. Complications, that's what they called it. As if her integrity had somehow interfered with their image. Lena listened. She didn't argue. She asked one question. "Do you want me to stop working?" There was an awkward pause. Someone cleared their throat. No one looked her in the eye. "We just think it may be best if you take a leave. With pay, of course, just until things settle." That night, Lena sat on her porch. The air was thick with July heat, and crickets buzzed in the garden bed. Her neighbor, Ms. Eleanor, brought over a pitcher of sweet tea and a folded newspaper. "You didn't ask to be anyone's symbol," she said, "but maybe you already were." The newspaper headline read, "Grace in Stillness. Who is the nurse in that viral photo?" Lena sighed, not angry, just ... tired in a way that had nothing to do with her shift. She never asked to be known. But now, she was, and the story people were telling about her wasn't the full one. So the next morning, she did something she hadn't planned. She sat down at her grandmother's kitchen table, opened her laptop, and typed a letter. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't even mention the officer by name. It simply said, "My name is Lena Matthews. I'm a nurse, a granddaughter, a neighbor, and a believer in staying calm when things get loud. I was just walking home. I didn't want a moment of fear to define my whole story, so I'm writing to tell the rest." She posted it quietly. No hashtags, no trending tags, just her name and her truth. By the end of the day, it had been shared over 100,000 times, not because it was angry, but because it was honest. That post led to interviews, the ones she politely declined. It led to calls from advocacy groups, from colleges asking her to speak, from city council members hoping for a quote they could use. But what surprised Lena most was the letter that arrived 3 days later. It was handwritten, in careful cursive. No return address. Inside was a single sentence. "You stood still when I didn't deserve it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know I was wrong." There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. And something about that letter didn't bring closure. It brought a question she hadn't thought to ask. Why? Why had a decorated officer, a man with over 20 years on the force, reacted the way he did to someone simply walking home? The answer to that question wouldn't come quickly, but it would unlock a part of the story no one expected, because the real truth wasn't just about that moment. It was about what came before it and what would come after. What Lena didn't know. Yet, what no one knew was that the man who had pushed her to the ground had once been pushed to ... not physically, not publicly ... but quietly, silently ... by a system that had taught him to see fear where there was none. And that would be the part of the story the world never saw in the photo, but Lena would, and it would change everything. Again, asterisk, it had been 12 days since the photo was taken. Lena had not returned to work. Not because she didn't want to, but because she needed quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from silence, but the kind that makes space for something to grow. Something had shifted inside her. Not anger, not fear, but a new kind of resolve. The world had taken a still frame of her and turned it into a story, but she knew stories were never flat. They weren't one image or one moment. They were full of shadows, backstories, forgotten corners, and hers wasn't finished yet. That letter, the unsigned one, with its single line of remorse, stayed on her dresser, folded and reread each night before sleep. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even her grandmother. Not because she was hiding it, but because she wasn't sure what it meant. Was it guilt? Was it an apology? Or was it simply a man trying to wash his hands clean with words? It should have ended there, but at DIDN single quotes T. On a Sunday afternoon, Lena was sitting in the back of a neighborhood bookshop. She liked it there. It smelled of paper and old wood, and nobody ever bothered her. She was flipping through a book on resilience, not looking for answers, just company, when someone tapped her shoulder. "Are you the nurse?" The woman whispered. Lena looked up. The woman was older, maybe late 60s, with kind eyes and a nervous way of clutching her purse strap. "I saw your photo," she said. "But that's not why I'm asking." Lena closed the book. "Then, why?" The woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice quiet. "Because I know who that officer is, and I know what happened to him. Before all this, that moment would be the thread that pulled the entire story wider." The woman's name was Mrs. Janine Elwood, retired teacher, lived in Dalton's neighborhood for nearly 15 years. "I'm not defending him," she said quickly, "but people don't just become what he did overnight." They sat in a quiet corner of the bookstore cafe. The woman spoke slowly, carefully. "Years ago, his wife got sick, cancer. It moved faster than anyone expected. I remember seeing him carry her into their car, night after night, for treatments. He barely slept." Lena listened, said nothing. "After she passed, something in him changed. He stopped coming to community events, left the church board, pulled his son out of school for a while. People said he started seeing things differently, more guarded, less trusting." Lena looked out the window. The street was calm, but inside her, the story was stirring. Grief doesn't excuse everything, but it explains more than most people allow. Still, that didn't change what happened. Lena asked the woman, "Why are you telling me this?" The woman didn't answer right away. Then she pulled something from her purse, a photograph, faded and soft around the edges. A smiling woman in a hospital gown, holding hands with a man who looked younger, lighter, almost unrecognizable. "That's her," the woman said. "His wife. She was a nurse too." Lena froze. It was a detail that didn't change the past, but suddenly made the present heavier. Could it be that seeing Lena that day, tired, in scrubs, walking alone, reminded him of someone he had lost? It didn't justify his actions, but it reshaped the meaning behind them. Later that night, Lena stood in front of her bathroom mirror, holding that photograph in one hand and her own hospital badge in the other. Two pieces of a puzzle she never asked to hold. She didn't know what to do with the new information. She wasn't planning to go public with it, but something inside her, a quiet stirring, told her that maybe the real story wasn't about a moment of injustice. Maybe it was about what happens after the moment, what choices are made, what healing is possible, and what forgiveness looks like when no one asks for it out loud. The next morning, a knock came at her front door. It wasn't a reporter. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, standing nervously with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Are you Miss Matthews?" he asked. "I am." He looked down, then back at her. His voice cracked just slightly. "I'm Ethan. Rick Dalton was my father." Lena didn't move, didn't speak, just opened the screen door gently and nodded toward the porch swing. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the creak of the chain and the rustle of a light wind through the maple trees. "He passed away last week," Ethan said quietly. Lena blinked, not sure if she'd heard him right. "He had a heart condition. Never told anyone, not even me. He was always too proud." Lena's hands were folded in her lap, still calm, listening. "He left me a letter," Ethan continued. "Said, if anything ever happened to him, I should talk to you. Not to ask for anything, just to say he never forgot what you didn't say." There was a weight in Ethan's words, the kind that didn't beg for pity or offer easy absolution. Just truth. "He was wrong," Ethan added. "I know that, and I think, deep down, he knew it too. But he didn't know how to undo what he'd done." Lena looked over at the young man, the son of the man who had once pinned her to the ground. Without reason. What could she say? What should she say? She reached for the folded letter still tucked inside the porch journal, the one she'd never answered, never responded to. "I believe people can change," she said softly, "but it doesn't always happen in time." Ethan nodded, his eyes glassy but grateful. Lena didn't offer forgiveness that day, but she offered something else. Conversation, a moment of shared stillness between two people tied together by a story neither of them wrote, but both had to carry. What Lena didn't know yet was that this moment, this quiet, porch-side conversation would mark the beginning of something new, because the story wasn't about her and the officer anymore. It was about what came next, and how even the most broken beginnings can still lead to something brave. There's a strange kind of stillness that comes after impact, not the moment of it, but the days that follow. Like the silence after a bell stops ringing, Lena felt it in her bones, that the headlines had faded, the public had moved on, but the echoes of what happened still lived in the corners of her home, in the way she hesitated before opening her front door, or how her fingers lingered just a second longer on her hospital badge before putting it down for the night. But it wasn't pain she felt now, not anymore. It was purpose, and it started with a note, not another apology. This one was written by a teenager named Sam, folded into eighths and slid beneath the clinic's community bulletin board. It read, "I don't know if anyone sees people like me, but I saw you, and it made me want to stay. Thank you." No last name, no contact, just a handwritten line that wrapped itself around Lena's heart and stayed there. That was the day she decided not to return to her old job, not because she didn't love the hospital, but because something bigger was calling. She didn't want to just treat wounds anymore. She wanted to help prevent them, the invisible ones, the kind people carried quietly for years, hidden behind polite smiles and heavy silences. Lena started, small. At first, it was a few folding chairs in the back room of the local library, a sign that read, "Safe space, story circles every Thursday, come as you are." She didn't expect many to show up, but they did. An exhausted teacher whose students had seen too much, a quiet janitor who hadn't spoken about his brother in 20 years, a teenage girl with sleeves too long for summer, and eyes that flicked nervously at the door every 5 seconds. They came, and they spoke, and when they couldn't speak, they listened, and when they couldn't do either, Lena simply sat beside them and let silence do the healing. Word spread slowly, like morning light slipping through curtains. More chairs were added, more volunteers offered snacks, coffee, even rides for those too afraid to take the bus alone. On Thursday, the mayor's aide stopped by. She stayed for the full session, cried twice, and left a note that said, "Why aren't we doing this in every part of the city?" Lena didn't want recognition, but she knew one thing. Her voice, once flattened against concrete, now carried further than she ever imagined. And then something unexpected happened. A reporter reached out, not to ask about the incident, but to ask about what she'd built after it. They wanted to feature the story, not as a piece of drama, but as a quiet triumph. A segment called The After, Stories of What We Do Next. Lena hesitated. The photo, the one that had gone viral, still hung like a shadow over her shoulder. Would people reduce her again to that moment, to a face on pavement, to a symbol? But she agreed, not because she needed attention, but because someone out there needed to know that survival could bloom into service. That being hurt didn't mean you couldn't heal others. The interview aired 1 week later. What followed wasn't a flood, it was a quiet wave. Emails from across the country, letters from nurses, young and old, a message from a corrections officer in Ohio who said, "I watched you sit with those people. It made me realize I've never really listened in my life." But the most unexpected note came in a square, weathered envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo of Lena. Not the one from the incident. A different one. This photo showed her sitting in the story circle, surrounded by people, hands held, eyes lifted, light pouring through the windows behind her. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "This is who you are, not what happened to you." That was the moment Lena knew something important. That power doesn't always look like protest signs or podiums. Sometimes it looks like a folding chair in a quiet room, a pot of tea on a chipped table, and the simple act of saying, "Tell me your story. I'm listening." One evening, as Lena was closing up the center, now a dedicated space, donated by a local church, a young woman approached the door with a hesitant knock. She was no older than 20, clutching a small backpack and holding herself as if she might disappear. "I don't have a story worth telling," the girl whispered. Lena smiled. "Then let's start with that." They sat for over an hour. No judgment, no pressure, just space. And at the end, the girl asked, "Why do you do This Lena thought about it for a long time. Then she said something she hadn't said aloud before. Because once, someone tried to erase me, but I realized, even if they take your voice for a moment, they can't take your echo, and I wanted to help people find theirs again. The girl nodded, just once, and stayed. That night, Lena walked home under a sky thick with stars, her heart full, her pace steady. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. The impact of kindness, like the ripple of injustice, travels further than you can ever see. And while some stories begin with pain, the ones worth remembering are the ones that end with purpose. Sometimes life circles back in ways that feel too precise to be coincidence. Like someone, somewhere, is stitching threads you can't quite see, pulling you gently toward something unfinished. For Lena, that moment arrived in the form of an embossed envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, the kind of paper you only use when something important is being asked. At first, she thought it was another local event, invitation. She received those often now, fundraisers, panels, conferences. But when she opened it, something inside her went still. It was a formal request to be the keynote speaker at the statewide Human Dignity Summit, a gathering attended by advocates, policymakers, educators, and law enforcement. The theme was voices that changed the conversation. Her name was printed at the top dot, and beneath it, in fine script, 10 years of impact. Lena read it 3 times. 10 years, it had been that long since that afternoon, since the sidewalk, the photo, the long ache that followed. 10 years of rebuilding, reimagining, and quietly reshaping lives, including her own. But standing on a stage, speaking with cameras watching, lights glaring, strangers dissecting her every word, that wasn't who she was, or at least, it hadn't been. She set the invitation aside. For 2 days, she tried to ignore it. She buried herself in work, in sorting pantry donations, organizing transportation for clinic members, setting up a new mental health support group. But each time her mind quieted, it returned. Not the invitation, but the moment. The moment her face met the pavement. The stillness after dot, and then, everything that came next. She realized something. That moment had been taken from her. Used, reposted, twisted. But this could be hers. A chance to tell the full story. Not the viral clip. Not the outrage. Not the speculation. But the truth. The quiet truth about how people rebuild. About how pain can turn into purpose. And about how the loudest revolution sometimes comes through kindness that refuses to give up. She said yes. The days leading up to the summit passed in a blur. She practiced her talk once, then again, then threw the script out and started over. She didn't want polish, she wanted truth. The summit was held in a grand, echoing hall with soft lighting and rows of folding chairs dressed in white covers. The air buzzed with polite anticipation. Lena stood backstage, a quiet calm wrapped around her. She wore a simple navy dress, her badge still tucked into the pocket, not for recognition, but for grounding. And then she stepped forward. The lights weren't blinding like she feared. The audience, surprisingly, wasn't a sea of blank faces. It was a collection of eyes that looked curious, open, ready. She spoke not about the moment of injustice, but about what came after, about choosing softness in a world that rewards bitterness. About healing in a system not built for it. About letting silence become a tool for listening, not erasure. When she finished, the room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It stood, quietly, gently, like they knew the weight of what they'd just heard. Lena returned backstage, her pulse steady, her hands folded at her stomach. And that's when she saw him. Not in uniform, not surrounded by cameras, just standing, older, thinner, a cane in one hand. Eyes that looked worn from more than just time. Slater, he said, her name softly, not questioning, not pretending they hadn't met before. Lena, she didn't flinch, not because she'd forgotten, but because she no longer lived in that moment. I wasn't sure I should come, he said. She said nothing. I don't expect anything from you, he added. I needed to see the person you became, because I never really saw the person you were. For a second, the years fell away. She remembered the weight of his hand, the heat of the concrete, the silence afterward. But then, another memory rose, louder, the laughter of a child in her circle, the tearful smile of a mother finally heard, the note on her desk that read, "You made me believe in people again." I didn't become anything, Lena said, her voice calm. I remembered who I already was. He nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "You changed things," he whispered. "No," she said gently. "People did. I just reminded them they could." He turned to go. She didn't stop him. Forgiveness, she'd learned, wasn't always about words. Sometimes it was about letting go of the weight someone else tried to give you. Sometimes the truest strength is simply not carrying it anymore. Later that night, Lena sat alone on a bench outside the hall. The stars above were quiet again, the same way they'd been that night so many years ago, but everything else had changed. She looked down at her hands, no longer shaking, no longer uncertain, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Not because she had to, but because something inside her had truly settled. The journey wasn't over, but the part that once felt unfinished, the part defined by silence and cement, finally had its answer. And it wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Asterisk. The strange thing about legacies is that you don't always see them while you're living them. They don't arrive with trumpets or declarations. They grow, slowly, in the spaces between ordinary moments. In the people you've helped, the words you've said, the silences you've held for others when they couldn't hold anything at all. Lena had returned home from the summit carrying no plaque, no award, just a folded program, a reusable water bottle, and a strange stillness in her chest, the kind that only comes after doing something you were truly meant to do. She didn't mention to many that Slater had been there. It wasn't the point of the story. She'd come to understand something deeper. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in the form of a courtroom or a confession. Sometimes it looks like a life rebuilt so beautifully, so defiantly, that the wound becomes something unrecognizable, a well of strength instead of a scar. 2 weeks later, she was back at the center, leading her Thursday circle. That night, the room was more full than usual. Chairs had to be added. New faces, young and old, sat side by side, some silent, some already weeping before a single word was spoken. A teacher brought her class. A local college sent a student group. One woman drove 3 hours after watching Lena's summit speech online. The circle was slow at first, tense, but Lena had learned to wait. And then, a teenage boy with a cast on his arm raised his hand. He didn't give his name, but he said, he used to believe people couldn't change, that once someone hurt you, that was it. But then I heard your story, he said, eyes fixed on her, and I thought, maybe we can learn something from the hurt. Maybe we don't have to carry it alone. That was the moment Lena felt it. Not recognition, but released. Something in the room had shifted, not just in him, but in everyone. Later, as she was tidying up, her phone buzzed with a message from a producer at a national radio show. They wanted to share her story as part of a new series called The Quiet Ones Who Moved Mountains. She politely declined. She didn't want to be a spotlight. She wanted to be a lamp. Small, steady, always on, especially when the nights felt too long for others to walk through alone. But what happened next wasn't something she could control, because people kept talking. Not about the incident, but about the ripple. Other cities began replicating the story circle model. A grant was established under her name, not by her request, but by a coalition of nurses and social workers who had been inspired to act at high school. Launched a resilience curriculum based on her methods of community care and conflict healing. And one day, the university where she'd once trained quietly added a new course, Narratives in Healing, the Lena Method, a class not about theory, but about listening, compassion, and reform grounded in human dignity. Lena only found out when a former student emailed her, confused but thrilled. She laughed, then cried, then laughed again. She hadn't set out to start anything. She'd only wanted to make meaning from something meant to break her. Years passed, her hair grayed, her center grew. She still wore the same worn navy scrubs on weekends, tending to community gardens, holding hands at clinics, mentoring younger nurses who called her Miss L. She never corrected them. She liked the warmth in the name. One fall morning, she received a small box in the mail. No note, just a thin stack of Polaroids, bundled with a ribbon. The photos were from people across the country, circles, gatherings, smiling faces, in parks, in church basements, on school lawns, some with signs that read, "We're still listening." Each photo had a name and date written on the back. Some had quotes. All shared one thing. They were places where people had found courage to speak, and others had found courage to hear. Lena looked through them one by one. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was exactly how she'd hoped it would be. One photo made her stop. A group of children in matching t-shirts that said, "Tell me your story," were standing in a circle, hands clasped, eyes closed. Leading them was a girl no older than 16. Lena recognized her. Samira, the girl who had once left a folded note beneath a bulletin board, the first thread in a long, invisible chain, now leading her own. Lena set the photo on her shelf, beside her teacup and plant. No awards, no press clippings, just that image. A reminder that some of the most powerful stories don't end with applause. They echo quietly, reshaping the world, one small circle at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena stepped onto her porch with a mug in hand. The wind was soft, the sky streaked in gold. She sat, she watched. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to rest, not because she was tired, but because she was finally full. Not of sorrow, but of hope, the kind you plant and water, even when the world tells you nothing will grow, because sometimes it does, and when it does, it grows everywhere.